He remembered the iron taste of sea salt on his lips the moment his father's banners finally dipped in submission. Balon Greyjoy standing upon the ramparts of Pike, the forces of the north arrayed below, their victory assured. In that fateful hour after Balon's rebellion ended, when the Iron Fleet had been broken and the Iron Islands lay at the mercy of the victorious Iron Throne, word spread across the Isles that the Stark Wolves, led by Eddard Stark himself, had paused upon the cusp of conquest. Instead of continuing the subjugation with fire and blood, Lord Stark had climbed the steps of Pike to parley with Balon Greyjoy. Beneath the gray sky, amidst the howling winds that raked the towers, these two men, once proud enemies, conversed in low voices. None knew precisely what was said, but from that moment onward, a strange new page in the saga of Westeros was turned. In the months that followed, rumors circulated throughout the Seven Kingdoms, some declaring that the Ironborn had pledged themselves to the North in exchange for leniency, others whispering that an arrangement concerning Balon's only surviving sons had been made. Indeed, everyone expected Lord Balon to deliver Theon, his last surviving heir after the deaths of Roderick and Meryn, over to Ned Stark's custody. That much followed the true course of history. But in this new turning of fate, rather than a forced wardship that left Theon stripped of his claim and heritage, there arose something new and unthinkable, a genuine alliance between House Greyjoy and House Stark. Theon still traveled to Winterfell, but not as a hostage. He went with the explicit blessing of his father, who sought a way to save the Iron Islands from ruin. Balon's ambition, shaped by the humiliating defeat of his rebellion, twisted and turned until he found a path for the Iron Islands to gain advantage without open war. Eddard Stark, for his part, had never thirsted for the oppression of the Ironborn. His sense of justice compelled him to treat the rebellious lords of the Isles sternly but fairly. Some said that Ned saw in Balon's predicament an opportunity to shield the North from further raids and to ensure that the Iron Islands would no longer pose a threat. Some, more cynically, suspected that Ned recognized how a marriage alliance or mutual defense pact might benefit the North. Most Northerners looked upon this new partnership with wariness. They remembered all too well the Ironborn's raids on the Stony Shore, the gruesome fates of fishermen, the screams and the reek of burning villages. Yet Eddard Stark insisted that the North, in victory, should show magnanimity. It was better to bind one's enemies with a firm handshake than to drive them into permanent vassalage through cruelty. From that uneasy foundation rose a new era in the relations between the Iron Islands and the North. Theon, a boy not quite out of childhood, was sent to Winterfell to learn the ways of the mainland. He arrived uncertain and proud, wearing his defiance like a shield, but was greeted not as a prisoner but as an honored ward and political bridge. The boy admired Robb Stark's skill with the sword and Jon Snow's quick wit, though he guarded his words around them, uncertain if friendship was truly possible. Despite all the resentments and hatreds that simmered in the hearts of both Northerners and Ironborn, Theon grew into a brash youth within the walls of Winterfell, learning the worship of the old gods in the Godswood and discovering the Northern sense of loyalty and honor. But the forging of this alliance was not merely a matter of exchanging wards. Across the seas, the captains and lords of the Iron Islands bent their knees before Balon Greyjoy again, acknowledging the King of Salt and Rock. But in truth, the seat of the Iron Islands was no longer secure. The presence of the North weighed upon them like a silent threat. The North had demanded that the Ironborn cease their reavings along the western coast, especially any encroachment upon Bear Island or the Stony Shore. In return, House Stark promised to preserve the privileges of the Ironborn to fish and trade along the west coast. The Iron Islands, reeling from the losses of their ships and warriors in the failed rebellion, found themselves in a precarious position. House Greyjoy's people were proud, but they needed to replenish their strength, to gather new ships, new men, new means of livelihood that did not rely solely on the reaving and pillaging that had been their tradition for centuries. And so an accord was reached. Fishing rights were expanded, but with strict guidelines. The Ironborn who ventured into the North were allowed to trade with Barrowton and White Harbor, provided they followed proper customs and refrained from violence. In exchange, Iron Islands merchants would not be harassed on the way to Old Town or Lannisport, an arrangement that King Robert Baratheon approved when Eddard Stark pressed him for a royal decree of safe passage. Tension still ran high, for old grudges remained, but a tenuous peace settled over the seas that separated the isles from the mainland. In Pike, many of Balon's sworn captains voiced their unease. They were free men of the sea, no one's thralls, but now they had to abide by foreign rules. Balon, once vehement about independence, had sobered after his humiliating defeat. He recognized that to survive and perhaps to rise again in the future, he needed time, gold, and a measure of cunning that had not served him well in open rebellion. Meanwhile, Theon flourished in the north. He grew close to Robb Stark, the heir of Winterfell, and followed him around like a younger brother might. But always, there existed an invisible wall between them, a sense that Theon was different. Sometimes, in the deep winter nights, he would recall the salt breezes of the Iron Islands and the bitter tang of the sea. Sometimes he would remember his brothers, Roderick and Meryn, who had fallen to the might of the Iron Throne. And sometimes he would remember his father's stern face, the pride in his gaze when he declared himself king of the Isles and the North. Yet none of these recollections softened his present reality. He was in Winterfell not as a hostage, but as a living symbol that the Ironborn and the North shared a common future. With Robb, he found laughter and companionship. With Jon, he discovered that he could trade jests and practice swordplay, though their rivalry never wholly vanished. Eddard Stark oversaw the boy's education, instructing him in the ways of justice and responsibility, teaching him how the Ironborn might someday live in harmony with the North if given the chance. Theon's presence gradually softened the northern perspective on the Ironborn, for he was not cruel or malicious. He was brash, yes, and cocky, but also loyal when shown respect. In turn, the Ironborn who heard word of Theon's acceptance at Winterfell grew intrigued. They heard that their prince was not tormented, not humiliated daily, and that he even sparred with the likes of the great Jon Umber's sons. Balon, receiving occasional reports through ravens, remained quiet on the subject, but his lips would twitch with satisfaction whenever word came that Theon was forging friendships. Years passed. Theon grew from a boy into a young man, tall and lean, with the easy grace of a skilled archer and swordsman. He was neither as broad-shouldered as Robb nor as cunning with words as Jon, but he possessed a certain swagger, an air of confidence that marked him as a Greyjoy. He came to love the North in his own way, discovering a surprising fondness for the sight of sunlight gleaming on snowdrifts, the solemn hush of the Godswood, the sense of unity among the small folk. And yet he never quite forsook the Iron Islands. Each year, he wrote letters to his father, though he rarely received more than curt responses. He also wrote to his sister, Asha, who remained in Pike, training under her father's watchful eye to become a fierce captain in her own right. Asha's letters overflowed with tales of sea spray, storms, the forging of new alliances among Ironborn captains. She teased Theon for growing soft among the Greenlanders, but there was no real malice in her words. He wrote back that the islanders should visit him in the north, for there was more to the land of winter than scrawny fishing villages and deep snow. During this period, Eddard Stark and Balon Greyjoy corresponded with growing frequency. Though separated by distance and temperament, the two lords gradually recognized that an alliance could be made stronger if built upon shared interests and mutual respect. The Iron Islands needed supplies, lumber, and certain ores that the North possessed in abundance. The North needed a buffer from the westerly pirates that sometimes raided the western coast, and they also craved trade routes that could bypass the Lannister-heavy ports. In time, a stable arrangement was hammered out. The Ironborn would protect northern merchant fleets from lesser pirates, while the North would facilitate favorable terms of trade for the Iron Islands. The king on the Iron Throne, Robert Baratheon, grumbled about the closeness forming between Stark and Greyjoy, but Robert valued Ned's counsel too highly to object for long. Besides, the crown was preoccupied with debts and feasts, and Robert cared little for the complexities of maritime trade so long as it did not threaten his realm's stability. Despite the simmering old resentments, a new shape began to form in the west of Westeros. Ironborn longships patrolled near Moat Caelin's shipping routes and escorted northern merchant cogs traveling to White Harbor. Northern traders, once fearful of Ironborn raids, began tentatively docking at Lordsport, exchanging winter wheat and hides for salted fish, iron or from Orkmont, and the distinctive black glass ornaments that some Ironborn fashioned from obsidian. It was not an easy or swift transition. Conflicts and misunderstandings arose. Twice, a drunken brawl erupted in the dockside taverns between Northerners and Ironborn, leading to several fatalities. Old hostilities proved hard to quench, but House Greyjoy paid the blood price to House Stark, as dictated by Northern custom. House Stark, in turn, demanded fair trials rather than summary executions. Through these gestures, the alliance, still fragile, endured. When the War of the Five Kings loomed on the horizon, it cast an ominous shadow over the entire realm. King Robert's unexpected death and the ascension of the boy king Joffrey Baratheon ignited tensions across the Seven Kingdoms. The Riverlands blazed under the cruelty of House Lannister. Rumors of dragons returning in the east hovered at the edges of every conversation. Robb Stark marched south to free his father, who had been taken prisoner in King's Landing. Yet in this altered timeline, the role of the Iron Islands in that great war shifted dramatically. Rather than seizing the moment to declare independence once again, Balon Greyjoy found himself bound by the alliance with the Starks, a treaty that had offered the Iron Islands respite and resources. The question was whether House Greyjoy would remain loyal to the North or if old ambitions would tear that pact asunder. Word reached Pike of Ned Stark's imprisonment and subsequent execution. The entire North howled in grief and rage when Lord Eddard was beheaded. Balon, reading the Raven's message, felt a pang of regret for a man he had both despised and respected. Meanwhile, Theon Greyjoy stood in Winterfell, stunned by the news. When Robb Stark called his banners to march south and avenge his father, Theon felt torn. By all rights, his loyalties were with the North. Robb was his friend and brother in all but blood. Yet how would his father respond if House Greyjoy was asked to muster its fleet in support of the Starks? The time of choice had come. In the old tale, Balon Greyjoy declared himself king of the Iron Islands once more, launching raids up and down the North's coasts, capturing Winterfell through Theon's misguided ambition. This time, events unraveled differently. Robb Stark, newly named king in the North by his bannermen, dispatched an envoy to Pike. The envoy carried letters appealing to the alliance, reminding Balon of the mutual defense pact that had been sealed by Ned Stark's hand and Balon's vow. If the North marched south to fight the Lannisters, would the Ironborn provide ships or at least remain neutral? Balon's decision came slowly. Asha pressed her father to break free and exploit the chaos, for that was the Ironborn way. Victarion, the taciturn master of the Iron Fleet, urged caution, mindful of the Isle's still recovering strength. And Theon, who wrote to his father, pleaded that House Greyjoy honor the pact with the North. He spoke of the goodwill the Ironborn had fostered over the years, the trade that now filled the coffers, the possibility of forging a new identity that did not rely solely on reaving. Balon, deeply conflicted, recalled the day Ned Stark stood on the ramparts of Pike and spared him total ruin. He remembered the ashes of defeat and the grudging respect that he had come to hold for the late Lord of Winterfell. In the end, Balon Greyjoy chose to uphold the alliance, albeit carefully. He would not call himself King of the Iron Islands. He would merely remain Lord Balon Greyjoy and order his captains to sail in defense of northern fleets wherever possible. That was the arrangement, to stand guard over the seas. He would not, however, risk his men in land battles. The North might have its war, but the Ironborn would not throw themselves into a quagmire of southern politics. They would only fulfill the obligations of protection and keep the supply lines open. Robb Stark, in need of allies, accepted this arrangement, though he had hoped for more direct naval support to strike at Lannisport. Still, the presence of the Ironborn on the seas meant that the Lannisters would be forced to divert their ships to guard their western coasts. Moreover, trade routes from White Harbor could remain safer than they might otherwise be. As Robb marched south, Theon accompanied him as both friend and counselor on Ironborn matters. Theon proudly wore the Kraken sigil of his house and the dire wolf of the Starks side by side. He was a son of two worlds now, a symbol that the wolf and the Kraken could ally. In the Riverlands, the campaign played out with certain similarities to the known history, but with differences shaped by the presence or potential presence of the Ironborn. The northern host still needed to cross the Twins, dealing with Walder Frey's demands. But the river lords, heartened by the news that the Iron Islands would not prey upon their western shores, joined King Rob's cause more swiftly. Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, remarked that it was strange to speak of House Greyjoy as a partner, but he remembered Eddard Stark's sense of honor and trusted that if Ned had forged this alliance, it must be grounded in something real. The Freys, meanwhile, sniffed that more ships in the North's corner might give them a strategic advantage over the Lannisters. But Walder Frey's petty ambitions lingered. He demanded a match between one of his daughters and a suitable lord or heir, though ironically Theon Greyjoy was not a candidate. He was the only surviving son of Balon Greyjoy, and Walder fretted about a Sea Devil daughter mixing with his own brood. In fierce battles along the Green Fork, the Northern cavalry repeatedly outmaneuvered the Lannisters, capturing Jaime Lannister at Riverrun in a surprise pincer movement. Theon rode alongside Robb, proving himself a skilled archer. Yet as the war dragged on, a gnawing sense of guilt tugged at Theon whenever he received ravens from Balon or Asha, reminding him that the Iron Islands were not truly eager for this conflict. The Ironborn had no love for the Tullis or the Lannisters. They simply wanted to be left alone to rebuild their strength, freed from the crippling taxes the Iron Throne might impose. Still, the Mutual Defense Pact demanded that the Ironborn keep Lannisport's port threatened. Victarion Greyjoy sailed menacingly up the coasts of the Westerlands, never landing a full-scale assault but forcing Tywin Lannister to station defenders to guard against raids. The presence of Ironborn longships on the horizon rattled the Lannisters, who remembered that the Greyjoys had once threatened to swarm the western coasts. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Joffrey's cruelty reached new heights under the watchful eye of Cersei Lannister. Sansa Stark, hostage in the Red Keep, prayed for her brother's victory. Tyrion Lannister, newly named Hand of the King, sought ways to outmaneuver the Stark forces. He recognized that a key difference in this war was the alliance between Stark and Greyjoy, and so he turned his cunning mind to ways of undermining that bond. If the Iron Islands could be persuaded to turn on the North, it would cripple Robb's efforts. Cersei toyed with the idea of offering Balon a better deal, perhaps the promise of independence or an official royal decree naming him King of the Isles, if he withdrew support from the North. Ravenspawn soared west from King's Landing carrying such proposals. But Balon Greyjoy, older and wiser than he had been in his rebellious youth, refused to be baited by Lannister promises. He distrustfully recalled how quickly Tywin Lannister had reduced House Reyne to dust, how swiftly the Iron Throne had shattered his own rebellion. So he dispatched a polite but curt refusal. The Ironborn would honor the alliance. They would remain guardians of the Western waters, no more, no less. Robb's campaign pressed forward, and the War of the Five Kings turned into a protracted struggle. Stannis Baratheon clashed with Renly over the rightful claim to the Iron Throne. The Tyrells eventually joined forces with the Lannisters after Renly's demise, as in the original timeline. But the Starks saw modest but meaningful gains, capturing Harrenhal for a time and sacking some Lannister holdfasts in the west. Theon Greyjoy's role in these battles was to keep a watchful eye on potential seaborne threats. He traveled to Seaguard and helped coordinate with Ironborn vessels patrolling the coastline. There, he developed a cordial relationship with Lord Jason Mallister, who found it peculiar but not unwelcome to receive Greyjoy officers in his harbor. The repeated presence of Ironborn warships also helped the Mallisters fend off smaller, opportunistic pirates who thought to take advantage of the chaos. Within Winterfell, young Bran Stark, newly crippled from his tragic fall, tried to understand how the Ironborn alliance might change the future. He saw fewer tensions among the small folk, for the lingering fear of Ironborn raids had subsided. Instead, with Robb and the main army in the south, Winterfell remained under the watch of Ser Roderick Castle, Lady Catelyn Stark having joined her son's campaign. The alliance meant that no Ironborn marauders would soon appear to lay siege to their home, and that small relief steadied the hearts of those who remained. Yet there was one figure who watched these developments with increasing disquiet: Roose Bolton. The Lord of the Dreadfort found his ambitions stymied by the close ties between the Iron Islands and House Stark. Bolton recognized that the Stark reliance on seaborne allies negated some of the strategic advantages he might have exploited in a war-racked realm. Moreover, the loyalty Theon had shown to the Starks made him less susceptible to Bolton's manipulations. Had Theon felt more alienated, more uncertain, perhaps Bolton might have found a way to use him as a pawn. But in this changed history, Theon displayed a steeled resolve forged by years of genuine camaraderie with the Starks, and an equally genuine desire to honor his father's vow. So the war waged on. The bloodshed was immense, as countless battles flared across the Riverlands. King Robb won victory after victory, but the combined might of the Lannisters and Tyrells eventually stalled his progress. The cunning of Tywin and the wealth of Highgarden made the southern front nearly impregnable. Robb's men found themselves forced into a war of attrition, and morale wavered. In this bleak landscape, the alliance with the Iron Islands proved crucial. Supply ships from White Harbor, protected by Ironborn longships, replenished the northern ranks. Without that precious lifeline, Robb's campaign might have collapsed earlier. Still, the war's demands pressed heavily on the Ironborn as well. Victarion reported that the Iron Fleet had engaged in a number of skirmishes with Lannister-aligned vessels. Battered and bruised, the Ironborn persevered, but the costs mounted. Then came the news that would shake all sides. Balon Greyjoy died unexpectedly. In the original timeline, Balon's death was rumored to be the result of a sorcerous plot by his exiled brother Euron. But here and now, the cause seemed more mundane. Balon, worn by age and stress, slipped from a bridge in Pike during a fierce storm, never to be seen again. Some whispered Euron's name still, for the exiled brother had a penchant for dark deeds, but no one had evidence. Others claimed the storm itself claimed Balon, as it had claimed countless sailors over the years. Whatever the truth, the Iron Islands stood leaderless at a crucial moment. The moment a Greyjoy died, the old custom demanded a kingsmoot, or at least a gathering of captains to determine the next rightful ruler. Asha Greyjoy, formidable and determined, stepped forward as the natural successor. She had served as her father's right hand in many matters and had proven her skill as a captain. Victarion, more conservative and stoic, also held a strong claim, given his seniority. Euron loomed on the periphery, rumored to be lurking in the Basilisk Isles, or in some far-flung place beyond the Sunset Sea. Many feared that Euron might return, as cunning and charismatic as the storms themselves, to snatch the Seastone chair from under them all. At that pivotal juncture, Theon Greyjoy, far away in the Riverlands at Robb Stark's side, heard the ravens cry. Balon was dead. A new leader must be chosen, and the Iron Islands were at a crossroads. Would they uphold the alliance with the North, or would they revert to the old ways of independence and reaving? Robb Stark, upon hearing the news, released Theon from his war duties, urging him to return to Pike and secure the stability of the Iron Islands. "You are as much a brother to me as any Stark," Robb told him in the war tent lit by flickering torches. "But your house needs you now." And so Theon departed, torn between sorrow for his father's passing and the weight of unexpected responsibility. He traveled by ship from Seaguard to Lordsport, accompanied by a small retinue of Northern Guards as an honor guard, men who had grown to respect him over the years. It was a strange sight for the Ironborn on the docks to see Theon returning with Greenlanders who called him a friend. A tense assembly of captains and lords was called in Pike's Great Hall, the waves pounding the cliffs outside. Asha stood boldly before the gathering, proclaiming that the Iron Islands must honor the alliance with the North and reap the benefits of trade and stability, for the future of the Isles depended on forging a new path. Victarion, who admired strength of arms above all, could not easily dismiss Asha's argument. He recognized that the Iron Fleet, though mighty, had suffered in skirmishes, and that a complete break from the alliance might lead the Iron Islands once again into a ruinous war. Many lesser captains roared their disagreement, swearing that the Ironborn would never bend the knee, that reaving was their birthright, that the drowned god demanded conquest. But Theon spoke up, brandishing his experiences in the north, reminding them that the old ways had nearly destroyed the Isles. "Our father led a rebellion once," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "We lost, and were left weaker than ever before. Only by forging ties with the North did we regain a measure of pride and prosperity. It is time we do not squander it." In that heated debate, threats and curses flew. But Theon and Asha, siblings once separated, found themselves oddly united, standing on the same dais, urging caution. Victarion, as gruff as he was, recognized that the times had changed. He had fought too many losing battles against the combined might of the mainland to believe that reaving alone would restore Ironborn glory. In the end, the captains reached a tenuous consensus. Asha Greyjoy would inherit her father's seat as Lady or Queen of the Iron Islands, but she would uphold the alliance with the North. Victarion pledged fealty to her, albeit with a reserved nod. Euron's looming specter still haunted them, but for the moment, a stable transition took shape. The crowning of Asha Greyjoy as leader of the Isles was marked by the chanting of the drowned god's priests. Black water poured over her face in a baptism of salt. She declared, in a firm voice echoing throughout the hall, that the Ironborn would no longer be fodder for the southern powers. They would be allies to the north, reaping the profits from trade and maritime power, but not squandering their strength in fruitless raids. This was a monumental shift for the Iron Islands. The old Reavers, those who had grown up worshipping the notion of paying the iron price, grumbled that they were turning into fishermen and merchants. But some among them, particularly the younger captains, embraced the possibility of forging a new identity. The sea would always be in their veins, the drowned god always in their prayers, but perhaps they did not need to be at war with every corner of Westeros to prove their valor. The mood in Pike's halls grew steadily more hopeful after Asha's ascension, though pockets of dissent remained. With Asha at the helm, Theon resumed his role as ambassador to the north. After all, he was well-placed. A friend of Robb Stark, knowledgeable about Winterfell and the intricacies of northern politics. Moreover, Theon held the love and respect of some younger Ironborn, who saw him as living proof that one could thrive among Greenlanders without losing one's Ironborn spirit. In months to come, Theon facilitated the shipment of fresh supplies to Robb's armies, ensuring that the alliance remained strong. He also saw that the Iron Fleet under Victarion's command prowled the western coasts to deter any Lannister or Tyrell attempts at a naval incursion. As the War of the Five Kings entered its middle stages, the North's luck began to sour, just as it did in the original timeline. Roose Bolton, cunning and treacherous, orchestrated secret communications with Tywin Lannister. He dangled the prospect of betraying Robb Stark if the Lannisters would grant him dominion over the North. But in this timeline, the presence of the Ironborn alliance complicated Bolton's schemes. He surmised that if the Ironborn remained loyal to the North, any attempt to seize Winterfell or break away from Robb would face the possibility of an Ironborn blockade along the coasts. This might isolate the Bolton-occupied territories from vital supplies or reinforcements. Bolton recognized that for a betrayal to succeed, he would need to neutralize both the Starks and the Greyjoys. With cunning, he reached out to various discontented captains in the Iron Islands, hinting at the possibility that House Bolton would support them if they revolted against Asha Greyjoy's leadership. It was a dangerous game, but Roose Bolton was not one to shy away from peril if it might yield power. Yet word of Bolton's secret overtures slipped through the shadows, carried by a thrall-turned-spy who believed in the new order championed by Asha and Theon. Warnings reached Pike, and from Pike, a swift raven soared to Robb's camp in the western Riverlands. Robb read the letter, his breath catching in disgust and fury. He realized that one of his most powerful bannermen was conspiring to betray the entire North. The letter was short on details but indicated that Bolton was seeking to undermine the alliance. Robb had suspected disloyalty might lurk among some houses, especially after news of his marriage to Jane Westerling, or another bride in this timeline, depending on how events unfolded, caused friction with the phrase. Yet he had not fully believed that Bolton would go so far as to sabotage the entire cause. Galvanized by this revelation, Robb Stark summoned his loyal lords, Galbart Glover, the great Jon Umber, Rickard Karstark, though Karstark still bore a grudge over the Lannisters, and Theon Greyjoy, who had traveled to rejoin the campaign. Plans were laid in hushed voices, lit by flickering candlelight, to trap Roose Bolton in his own treachery. If Bolton expected to betray the North to the Lannisters, Robb intended to turn that plan on its head and capture him instead. Coordinating with Asha and Victarion, they set a plan in motion to feign weakness along a certain stretch of the Trident, inviting Bolton to make his move. At the same time, Ironborn ships would blockade the neck, ensuring no southern reinforcements could slip through to bolster Bolton's forces. A combined northern and Ironborn strategy was emerging to root out the betrayer before he could strike. When the appointed time came, Bolton's men marched under the pretense of reinforcing Robb's host. Instead, they struck from within, aiming to capture Robb. But they found themselves ambushed by a far larger force. Northern cavalry pincer attacked them, while Theon and a small company of Ironborn reavers, newly landed from the west, slammed into Bolton's rear lines with savage vigor. Though the Ironborn had chosen to set aside large-scale reaving, they had not lost their skill at close combat. They fought with the ferocity of men defending their new allies, eager to prove to the realm that the Ironborn were no mere turncloaks. The battlefield was a swirl of mud, horseflesh, and clashing steel. Bolton's men, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, fell into chaos. Those who tried to flee found Ironborn waiting for them by the riverside. Roose Bolton himself, realizing too late the trap he had walked into, tried to escape with a handful of loyalists. But Great John Umber blocked his path, roaring a challenge. And Theon Greyjoy, bow in hand, loosed an arrow that took one of Bolton's guards in the neck. Bolton was forced to yield. He was brought in chains before Robb Stark. The king in the north gazed coldly at the man who had planned to sell them all to the Lannisters. Even among Robb's bannermen, the question was whether Bolton should face immediate execution. Some demanded that his entire house be extinguished as a lesson to traitors. Theon remembered Eddard Stark's sense of justice, how he had once shown clemency to Balon Greyjoy in victory. Now, ironically, that same moral question hung in the air. Should Robb show leniency, or should he crush House Bolton to prevent any future threat? In the end, Robb Stark chose a harsh but measured path. Roose Bolton would die for his treachery, executed by the king in the North's own sword. As for House Bolton, its lands and titles would be stripped, given over to another loyal northern house or a combination of smaller families. The dreaded flayed man sigil was outlawed. Only a few Boltons of lesser lines, who had not participated in the treason, were permitted to remain as minor lords under close watch. That punishment, though severe, was widely applauded among the northern lords, who believed that betrayal must be answered with unwavering retribution. It also served as a demonstration to the realm that the new alliance of Wolf and Kraken was potent and decisive. With Bolton removed, the war continued, but Robb's position became marginally stronger. Though the Red Wedding might still have loomed in the minds of Walder Frey, the opportunity for a devastating betrayal was diminished by the presence of a fiercely loyal Ironborn navy. Moreover, House Frey remained uncertain whether, if they turned on the king in the north, the Ironborn might sail up the Trident and exact vengeance. The knowledge that Ironborn ships lurked in the waters beyond the Twins was enough to keep Walder Frey circumspect, at least for a time. Nonetheless, cunning words from Tywin Lannister and the promise of a better marriage alliance with the Tyrells still attracted Walder's greedy ambitions. The seeds of betrayal were not entirely uprooted. Far away, in Pike, Asha Greyjoy bolstered the island defenses, half dreading the possibility that Euron might return. But so far, no sign of the Crow's Eye emerged, and it seemed that Euron was content to sail distant seas. The Iron Islands, under Asha's leadership, continued to strike a balance between tradition and adaptation. Captains set forth on voyages to Essos, bringing back new spices and goods from the free cities, then trading them in the north. Lord Sport and Pike were steadily rebuilt, the scars of Balon's rebellion fading with each passing year. The people of the Isles, if not entirely appeased, recognized that the prosperous alliance with the North was better for their children than endless warfare. The old ways survived in ceremonies, the worship of the drowned god, and the forging of iron victories in smaller raids against outlaws or pirates. But the scale of reaving was far less than it once was, as if the Iron Islands had decided to join the greater realm in a less destructive capacity. As the war ground on, eventually culminating in the heartbreak of Robb's leadership tested against the cunning might of the Lannisters and Tyrells, the North found itself at an impasse. King Rob had scored no decisive victory to march upon King's Landing, and his younger sisters remained hostages there. Even with the Ironborn as allies, he lacked the sheer manpower to overcome the combined forces of House Lannister and House Tyrell in open battle. Stannis, likewise, was trapped in a stalemate in the Crownlands or at Storm's End, depending on how events transpired with Melisandre and the Shadowbinding. Meanwhile, word arrived from beyond the wall that Mance Rayder was gathering a great host of wildlings, that White Walkers, once thought mere myth, were stirring. The threat from the north, so often forgotten in the games of Southern Thrones, began to loom large. At this crucial juncture, the alliance with the Iron Islands revealed its greatest value. With the coast secure, House Stark could pivot to the real danger rising in the lands of endless winter. Theon, who had returned to the Riverlands, was summoned to a new council of war. There, Robb explained that the safety of their home, their families, and all of Westeros depended upon unity in the face of the coming winter. "We have bled enough fighting for who shall sit the Iron Throne," Robb declared, voice low but resolute. "Let the Lannisters and Tyrells keep King's Landing. Our war was for the North's independence, yes, and for avenging my father. But the dead do not care who is king or what crown is worn. The dead are coming, if the rumors are true." Such talk was not easy for proud northern lords to accept. They had spilled blood for the king in the north, for the dream of a free north. Yet the realization that winter's horrors might soon descend on them, overshadowing any petty southern dispute, gradually took hold. If the dead threaten the living must unite. Moreover, the new allies from the Iron Islands recognized that if the rumors proved true, if White Walkers and Whites truly marched beyond the wall, then no strip of sea would protect the Isles forever. The North's fall would usher in a darkness that might eventually find its way to every shore. Thus, Robb Stark decided on a bold approach. He would treat with the Lannisters, perhaps even with King's Landing, for a truce to face the threat in the North. Tyrion Lannister, as Hand, might see reason if presented with indisputable proof of the supernatural threat. Catelyn Stark, who had grown weary of war, agreed that negotiation was worth attempting if it might save thousands of lives. Theon traveled to Pike to meet with Asha, explaining Robb's plan. Asha weighed the risks, acknowledging that the Ironborn might lose face if they abandoned the chance to carve out a truly independent domain, but she also recognized the unstoppable nature of an undead threat. The Ironborn had little experience with the White Walkers, but they had their own superstitions, rumors of drowned whites, stories of dead men walking the ocean floor, which the priests of the drowned gods sometimes muttered about in half-hushed warnings. If the ancient enemy was rising in the far north, the Iron Islands could not stand alone. And so, in a remarkable gesture, Asha commanded Victarion to sail with a portion of the Iron Fleet up past the Neck, into the Bay of Seals, eventually mooring near White Harbor. The presence of Ironborn warships in those chilly waters startled the locals, but soon enough, the people recognized that these ships bore the banner of the Kraken, allied with the Direwolf. They brought with them not raiders, but Ironborn willing to stand with the North against something far more terrifying than any southern army. The Great Council that convened at Winterfell might have been one of the more astonishing sights in the history of Westeros. Northern lords, Ironborn captains, and envoys from King's Landing, some of them carefully escorted Lannisters or Tyrell emissaries, gathered in the Great Hall of Winterfell. There, tales were told of dead men rising beyond the wall, of a night's watch reduced and desperate, of wildlings massing near the Frostfangs. To quell any doubts, Jon Snow, who had joined the Night's Watch in this timeline much as before, sent a letter verifying that the horrors were real, that Rangers had encountered whites. Robb, holding that letter before all, demanded that if there was any shred of decency left in the southern courts, they would grant the North respite from their war and support the fight against the undead. The Lannister envoys, of course, balked. They suspected a trick. Yet they also recognized that the war had dragged on, leaving the crown in crushing debt. The idea of letting the North handle the savage men beyond the wall without further meddling appealed to some. If the North fell, it would at least weaken a rival. But if the rumors were true, the threat could roll south eventually. Politics swirled, negotiations abounded, but the Ironborn presence in Winterfell played an unexpected role in convincing the envoys. Witnessing proud reavers from the Isles stand side by side with the Northern Lords lent an air of gravity to the threat. These were not men easily frightened, nor easily corralled, yet they spoke of an enemy that defied the living. Perhaps there was truth to this madness. Eventually, a tenuous ceasefire was brokered. The Lannisters would not march north to subjugate the North or the Iron Islands, provided that Robb Stark recognized Joffrey or Tommen, depending on the timeline's progression, as king on the Iron Throne for the duration of the crisis. In turn, the Crown would supply shipments of dragonglass from Dragonstone, rumored to be effective against the White Walkers, though the alchemists had yet to confirm the rumors. None of this resolved the fundamental issues of the realm. Stannis and his followers scoffed at the notion of a truce, the Tyrells eyed their roses greedily, and many Freys snarled about lost marriage pacts. But for the moment, an uneasy peace settled over the southern front. The time had come for the North and the Iron Islands to gird themselves for the true war, the war against the Long Night's return. Robb Stark recalled his banners from the south, his men weary but determined. The Ironborn, under Asha and Victarion, shifted their focus from patrolling the Westerlands to reinforcing the coasts near Eastwatch by the Sea, preparing to ferry supplies to the Night's Watch if needed. Theon, after so many years of living in Winterfell, found himself gazing at the snows of the north with a new sense of foreboding. This was no longer about southern politics or proud houses clashing for a seat of power. This was about survival itself. Up at the Wall, Jon Snow discovered that the wildlings, led by Mance Rayder, possessed the same fear of the White Walkers that haunted the Night's Watch. Over the course of precarious negotiations, the King Beyond the Wall agreed to send envoys to speak with Robb Stark, on the condition that the Free Folk would be allowed safe passage south of the Wall to escape the undead. In the original timeline, such a notion seemed unthinkable to many Northerners. But in this changed world, the North had grown used to forging alliances once deemed impossible. Had not the Iron Islands once been their most bitter foe? Yet now they stood together. If the living were to survive, they must stand as one. And so it came to pass that Mance Rayder himself led a small group through the Wall, escorted by Jon Snow, to Winterfell. The image of a wildling king sitting at the same table as King Robb Stark, with Asha Greyjoy on his left and Great Jon Umber on his right, was a testament to how drastically the times had changed. Mance Rayder made his request. Let the free folk pass, give them land or at least let them settle in the gift, and in return they would add their numbers to the living host that would face the White Walkers. There were arguments, many of them heated, especially from lords who recalled centuries of wildling raids. But eventually, a deal was brokered, in part thanks to Jon Snow's pleas, reminding them that the real foe was the army of the dead. With that uneasy pact in hand, thousands of wildlings began streaming south of the Wall, overseen by watchful Night's Watch rangers and northern soldiers. Tents sprang up across the gift, settlements formed in a matter of weeks. The Ironborn, intrigued by these fierce free folk, occasionally offered them passage on their ships along the coast, though the wildlings looked at the sea with suspicion. Meanwhile, the blacksmiths of the north, aided by the rumored shipments of dragonglass, began forging weapons specifically designed to fight the White Walkers. From the forges of Winterfell, Moat Cailin, and even the Iron Islands, a new arsenal took shape. Obsidian-tipped spears, arrowheads of dragon glass, small blades that might shatter another. Among all these preparations, a sense of dread suffused the north. The days shortened, the winds grew colder, and rumors trickled in of scattered Night's Watch outposts being overrun, of shrieking wights that hunted by moonlight. Theon Greyjoy found himself assigned to Eastwatch by the Sea, assisting with the coordination of supplies, for his knowledge of ships and tides proved invaluable. He stood upon the Wall's easternmost tower, gazing out at the frosty ocean. Could the undead march across frozen waters? He did not know, but if they did, the Ironborn would meet them with axes and swords. The drowned god might stand with them yet against the icy hordes. Then the dreaded moment arrived. The White Walkers advanced on the Wall in force, accompanied by a swirling blizzard that blotted out the sun. The horns sounded along the ramparts. The great gates were sealed. Thousands of wildlings, joined by the Night's Watch, the Northern Army, and a contingent of Ironborn fighters, prepared to defend Eastwatch and Castle Black. Jon Snow, recently returned from a mission beyond the Wall, commanded the Watch's defense. King Robb Stark, flanked by Grey Wind, took command of the northern forces near Castle Black. Asha Greyjoy herself led a detachment of Ironborn archers, while Victarion commanded ships along the Bay of Seals, ensuring that no flank attack came from the sea. The battle that unfolded was as grim and terrifying as the old stories had foretold. Whites surged across the tundra, silent except for the clacking of bones and the scraping of ice. White Walkers rode dead horses, their glowing blue eyes scanning for weaknesses. At Eastwatch, Theon Greyjoy and his men fired volley after volley of flaming arrows, some tipped with dragonglass, into the advancing dead. The creeping cold was so intense that the men's beards froze, icicles forming on eyelashes. Theon found himself side by side with both northern men and free folk archers, each group eyeing the other warily, but united in terror. "Loose!" Theon roared, letting an arrow fly. Its tip struck a White in the chest, bursting it into shards of frozen flesh that collapsed onto the snowy ground. Castle Black, the fighting was even more brutal. The White Walkers, cloaked in cold mists, sought to break through the gate. Jon Snow, Longclaw in hand, faced one of the other champions in single combat. When Valyrian steel met ice-forged blade, the air erupted in sparks and frost. Robb Stark, astride a powerful northern stallion, led a cavalry charge into the thick of the Whites, attempting to scatter them before they could breach the tunnel. The living fought desperately, the shrieks of the undead mingling with the war cries of men. Ghost, Jon's direwolf, leapt at spectral enemies, while Grey Wind bounded at Robb's side, teeth bared. In the freezing darkness, it was the new alliances that made the difference. Asha Greyjoy's archers rained death from the battlements, while Ironborn raiders took up axes and joined the wildlings on the ground to halt any break in the lines. At Eastwatch, the synergy between the Ironborn and the Night's Watch ensured that repeated assaults by Whites from the shoreline were repelled. Victarion's ships fired flaming projectiles into any undead stragglers that tried to circle around by sea. The synergy was not perfect. Men still died in droves, and the night was filled with screams. But the presence of the Ironborn, now thoroughly committed to the living's cause, prevented the White Walkers from outflanking the Wall's defenders. In the end, after a night of unimaginable horror, dawn broke. The White Walkers, seeing their losses mount under the barrage of obsidian and Valyrian steel, withdrew into the swirling snowdrifts beyond arrow range. Whites collapsed into the snow, left behind like broken puppets. The living, battered and haunted, took stock of their casualties. Many had fallen, but the Wall still stood. The alliance of Wolf and Kraken, along with the Free Folk and the Black Brothers, had held firm. The threat was not vanquished, but it had been halted for now. It was a victory, or at least a reprieve. In the weeks following that battle, the realms south of the Neck began to grasp the severity of the situation. Scouts and ravens carried news of the undead horde battered at the Wall. King's Landing, still embroiled in power struggles, was forced to confront that there might indeed be a greater enemy. The Tyrells, once content to watch the North fight its own battles, began sending scouts. Even Dorne, far to the south, took note, though they trusted in deserts and scorching sun to keep them safe from the cold menace. Amid these shifting tides, the Iron Islands emerged with a renewed sense of self. They had fought side by side with the North, proven themselves as more than just a band of raiders. Theon Greyjoy, once a ward of Winterfell, had become a champion of the Alliance, forging ties not only between houses but between entire peoples. Asha Greyjoy, ruling over the Isles with a pragmatic hand, gained the respect of her captains by delivering real spoils, trade, alliances, and the sense that the Ironborn's prowess was recognized by even the proudest mainland lords. Their sigil, the Golden Kraken, now flew over Eastwatch and along the decks of ships that patrolled icy waters, reminding all that the Ironborn were no longer enemies of the realm, but defenders of it. As the long night threatened to envelop Westeros in a war that would overshadow all petty feuds, The union of the dire wolf and the kraken stood as a testament to what could be achieved through shared hardship and mutual respect. The men of the North and the Iron Islands had once shed each other's blood, had once harbored hatreds as deep as the ocean. But in this altered tale, their willingness to parley, to bend pride, and to forge a joint path led them to a position of strength none could have foreseen in the days when Balon Greyjoy first rebelled. The memory of Ned Stark and his decision to treat with Balon, rather than simply destroying him, lingered in every corner of the North and the Isles. That singular choice, shaped by honor rather than cruelty, had planted the seed for an alliance that would stand against terrors far greater than any mortal king. In time, new chapters would unfold. Perhaps the Southern Lords would join the fight against the White Walkers in force, forging a grand alliance of all of Westeros. Perhaps Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, stirring in Essos, would arrive to turn the tide with living flame. Perhaps Euron Greyjoy would return from the shadows, bringing with him dread artifacts or foreign sellswords to challenge his niece's rule. The future was unwritten, filled with perils and hopes alike. But for the moment, one thing was certain. In a harsh and unforgiving land where old grudges never died, the wolves of the North and the krakens of the Iron Islands had found common ground. Steel had clashed, blood had been spilled, but a bond had emerged stronger than the storms of the Sunset Sea. And so, as a white sun rose over the snows and the waves, the new alliance stood ready to face the unrelenting darkness and whatever trials yet lay ahead.